The last clod of earth had scarcely struck Daniel Alderman's coffin when his elder brother ordered Ruth's belongings carried out of Meadow End Farm. Jonas did not raise his voice. He stood beside the churchyard gate in a black coat polished at the elbows and read from the solicitor's letter as if announcing the price of barley. Daniel had died without a child and without a will. The lease, the livestock, and the furnished farmhouse therefore returned to the Alderman partnership, which Jonas now controlled. Ruth's marriage portion, he said, had long ago been absorbed by Daniel's debts. Behind him, 2 farmhands set her wooden chest, a rolled mattress, and 3 bee skeps in the mud. One skep contained the only colony she had managed to save from the autumn losses. Its inhabitants stirred uneasily beneath the wicker. "You brought sickness among the hives," Jonas said. "I cannot risk the remaining orchards for sentiment." Ruth looked past him toward the slope where 70 colonies had once stood. Daniel had taught her to distinguish the piping of a young queen from the restless roar of a queenless hive, though the deeper lessons had come from her mother, a Sussex bee mistress who marked weather, bloom, and yield in narrow black notebooks. Ruth had spent 11 years improving Meadow End's stocks. Now the surviving boxes bore chalk crosses for burning. Mr. Pritchard, the parish solicitor, cleared his throat. "There is one bequest." From his case he produced a cracked deed tied in green tape. Briarbank Apiary lay beyond the eastern boundary wall. 3 acres of neglected orchard, a roofless honey house, 12 rotten box hives, and arrears of £2, 8 shillings. Daniel had purchased it privately 6 months before his death, using money from the sale of his watch. The property had no road of its own. Access depended upon a footpath Jonas disputed. Jonas smiled for the first time. A fitting estate for her. Ruth accepted the deed. Under Daniel's thumbprint was a penciled notation in his hand. "Ask why the old bees fly east." She folded the paper before Jonas could see it. By dusk, Ruth had dragged her chest and surviving colony half a mile along the parish lane. Ned Vale, a 12-year-old farm boy whose mother had once worked beside Ruth in the honey room, brought a barrow without asking payment. He stopped at the iron gate of Briarbank, where brambles had grown through the hinges. "They say the honey killed a child here," he whispered. "People say many things when records have been lost." The honey house had lost a third of its slate roof. Rain had softened the plaster and warped the extraction room floor. Against its east wall stood an old brick warming chamber with no visible flue. Ruth cleared one dry corner, placed the live skep on 2 boards, and fed the bees syrup from her last cone of sugar. She slept in her cloak beside them, while frost formed in the broken windows. At dawn, the colony began to fly. The workers should have gone south, toward the remaining ivy blossom along the river. Instead, they rose over the derelict orchard, crossed the disputed path, and vanished through a finger-wide crack at the foot of Jonas's boundary wall. They returned carrying no pollen, but several bore crumbs of pale gray wax on their legs. Ruth caught one gently in a glass. The wax smelled faintly of rosemary and warm stone. It was not the yellow wax of Meadow End, nor the brown comb abandoned in Briarbank's hives. Someone, sometime, had maintained another colony beyond the wall. That afternoon, Jonas nailed a notice to the gate. It gave Ruth 7 days to cease trespassing on the estate path. She spent the first of them making one room habitable. From fallen rafters she salvaged sound oak, and with Ned's help she patched the roof above the old bottling room. Mrs. Vale sent a kettle, 2 blankets, and a loaf, but would not cross the gate. The village believed Briarbank's ground poisoned. Even the blacksmith refused to sharpen Ruth's hive tool until she paid in advance. Ruth did not argue. She worked. She scraped foul comb from 6 boxes, burned only what showed true brood disease, and boiled the remaining wood in washing soda. The dead colonies told an untidy story. Some cells had sunken caps consistent with foul brood, yet whole frames lacked the ropey remains she expected. Other bees lay with tongues extended beneath perfectly sound honey. On the landing boards she found a glittering blue-green residue. Daniel had mentioned the same color before his sudden illness. Jonas's new estate steward, Ambrose Kells, had ordered the orchards washed against canker with a preparation purchased cheaply from a chemical works. Daniel objected, after bees began dying. 3 days later, he collapsed beside a cider vat and never recovered. Ruth wrapped samples in clean paper and labeled their locations. Skill without records, her mother had always said, became only another opinion men could dismiss. The eastern wall continued to trouble her. It was 9 feet thick where the honey house joined it, though an exterior measurement suggested barely 3. The brick warming chamber gave off a mild heat each afternoon, despite having no fire. When Ruth struck its face with Daniel's brass hive key, the upper courses rang solid, while the bottom answered with a hollow interval. On the third morning, a swarm of feral bees appeared above the wall. They spiraled once over Ruth's repaired boxes, then entered the crack in a narrow golden stream. Ned watched, open-mouthed. "There's a hive inside." "There is space inside," Ruth corrected. "Whether it was made for bees remains to be proved." She traced the crack and found a row of tiny copper tubes hidden behind ivy. Air flowed outward, warm and scented with old wax. Each tube was protected by a downward lip that excluded rain. This was no accidental cavity. Someone had built a wintering wall, using the mass of brick to moderate cold. Ruth's first impulse was to open it. Her second, wiser one, was to examine the deed. Its boundary description began at a hawthorn stump no longer standing, ran east by 32 perches, and returned along the bee wall and chambers appurtenant. The phrase had been crossed through in different ink. Beside the alteration were initials that did not match the witnessing solicitor. Mr. Pritchard received her in his office, but kept the door open. He admitted the deed was a copy made from an 1841 conveyance. The original estate map had disappeared during a fire in the parish chest. "A crossed phrase proves little," he said. "And Mr. Alderman says the wall is his. Then why does my building open into it?" "Does it?" The question was fair. Ruth returned to Briarbank without satisfaction, but not without purpose. She needed an entrance and evidence that it predated the disputed alteration. Ned earned 6 pence a day helping her clear the orchard. Beneath dead nettles they found thyme, borage, and winter savory planted in deliberate bands. Old pear trees, thought barren, carried clusters of short fruiting spurs. Ruth pruned only diseased wood, spread clean straw beneath the hives, and set shallow trays of water with stones for landing places. Within a fortnight, 2 widows brought her damaged skeps for advice. She charged nothing for inspection and a penny for each sound replacement bar. The village did not embrace her, but it began to watch. Ambrose Kells came on horseback during the 3rd week. His boots were spotless despite the mud. He offered £3 for Briarbank, enough to clear the rates and purchase a railway ticket south. "The estate wants the wall repaired," he said. "Your ruin obstructs the work." "Then the estate may establish its boundary in law." His pleasant expression thinned. "A widow living alone should not invite litigation." After he left, Ruth found the copper ventilators packed with clay. She and Ned cleared them before the hidden colony suffocated. That night she heard scratching beneath the floor and caught a man forcing the gate. When she raised her lamp, he fled, leaving a pry bar and 1 glove marked with the estate's blue thread. Ruth took both to Constable Rusk. He recorded the complaint but said a common work glove could prove nothing. Jonas, meanwhile, petitioned the magistrates to close the disputed path. Without it, Ruth could not take honey to market or bring slate for repairs. The hearing was set for December. Cold sharpened the mystery. On frosty mornings, a rectangular patch remained clear upon the warming chamber. Ruth removed the crumbling plaster there and exposed bricks stamped HB. Most were laid lengthwise, but 6 formed a shallow hexagon. At its center was a round plug of fired clay pierced by 2 slots exactly the width of her hive key. The plug resisted until she warmed it with cloths soaked in hot water. Then it turned a quarter circle. A counterweight moved inside the wall, and a narrow door opened without disturbing the masonry above. Warm, honeyed air breathed into the room. Beyond the door lay a passage no wider than Ruth's shoulders. Built-in shelves held long, glass-fronted observation hives, most empty, connected to the copper flight tubes. One colony still occupied the farthest box, its bees clustered around dark comb. A brick-lined channel beneath the shelves carried gentle warmth from a composting chamber outside, while adjustable vents controlled moisture. The design was decades ahead of the crude winter sheds used locally. At the end stood a cedar chest on iron feet. Its lock had already been broken. Inside were empty document wrappers, a woman's veil, 3 carved queen cages, and a slate engraved with columns of dates and symbols. Someone had searched the chamber before Ruth arrived. On the veil, embroidered almost invisibly in gray silk, were the initials H.B. Ruth closed the door and told only Ned what she had found. She feared his excitement might betray them, but he surprised her by asking what the bees needed first. Together they carried in syrup and removed mold from the unoccupied boxes. The surviving colony was unusually calm and dark, with queens reared from a line Ruth had never seen. Its comb contained the pale wax found on her workers. The slate symbols corresponded to bloom periods, mating flights, winter survival, and honey yield. Ruth recognized the method because her mother had used a simpler version. One recurring mark resembled a crown divided in half. Beside it, survival figures continued across 27 winters. The name on the veil led Ruth to the oldest person willing to speak, Elspeth Moss, formerly laundress at the Great House. Hannah Briar, she said, had been the estate owner's illegitimate half-sister, trained in apiculture in France. She established the apiary in the 1830s and developed hardy bees that restored pollination after a severe winter. Sir Matthew Alderman publicly took credit. When Hannah demanded recognition and wages for village bee women, she was declared unstable and removed. "She did not poison a child?" Ruth asked. Elspeth's mouth tightened. "The child died of scarlet fever. The honey tale began after Hannah vanished." Hannah had left no acknowledged heirs, but she had created a benefit fund from honey sales. Elspeth remembered women receiving small winter payments until the year of the Paris chest fire. Afterward, the money stopped, and Briarbank was sealed. The empty wrappers in the cedar chest bore fragments of red sealing wax. Someone had taken whatever proved the trust. Ruth copied the slate by lamplight. Daniel's penciled question now seemed less like curiosity than instruction. He had discovered the bee's flight, but died before he could explain. Among his few effects, returned grudgingly by Jonas, Ruth found an invoice for 6 gallons of Kels's orchard wash and a torn memorandum. Wall chamber found. AK knows. Search tithe copy. The tithe map was held at the diocesan registry in Chichester, a journey Ruth could not afford. She sold her silver wedding brooch for £1 14 shillings, paid the rates, and entrusted the hives to Mrs. Vale and Ned for 2 days. The sacrifice hurt more than she expected. The brooch had been Daniel's first gift, but grief could not be preserved by locking every useful thing away. At the registry, a clerk initially refused her access. Ruth presented the deed, paid the copying fee, and waited 6 hours. The 1840 tithe map showed Briarbank's 3 acres extending to the western face of the estate wall. More important, a dotted enclosure lay within the wall itself, labeled Bee Chambers and School. A schedule named Hannah Briar as occupier and Sir Matthew as trustee. Ruth purchased a certified copy with her remaining money. When she returned, smoke stood above Briarbank. The repaired bottling room was burning. Mrs. Vale and 3 villagers formed a bucket line from the pond while Ned dragged hive boxes into the orchard. Ruth ran past the flames to the hidden door. Clay again blocked the ventilators, and smoke seeped into the passage. She opened every upper vent, wrapped the surviving observation hive in wet sacking, and carried it out with bees boiling around her veil. A falling rafter struck her shoulder. Ned pulled her clear seconds before the roof collapsed. They saved 7 colonies and the cedar chest. The slate shattered in the fall, but Ruth's copy remained in her coat. Constable Rusk found lamp oil poured along the western sill. This time there were witnesses. Mrs. Vale had seen Kells's assistant riding from the gate. Jonas arrived before dawn, not to help but to insist the dangerous property be condemned. He offered Ruth £5 in front of the constable. "You are fortunate to be alive," he said. "Daniel was less fortunate." For the first time, Jonas looked afraid. Ruth's shoulder kept her from lifting for a week. Villagers who had merely watched now acted. The blacksmith donated nails. A mason named Caleb Finchley assessed the walls and refused payment until spring. Mrs. Vale organized meals. Not everyone believed Ruth's accusations, and the innkeeper still called Briarbank cursed. But 7 families sent 1 worker each to raise a temporary roof. Their help created an obligation Ruth accepted seriously. She opened the surviving chamber on Sunday afternoon and showed them Hannah's wintering system. She did not mention the missing trust papers. Instead, she explained how controlled ventilation, clean comb, and selective queen rearing could reduce losses. 3 orchard tenants asked to place colonies under her supervision. The estate answered with an injunction. Jonas claimed Ruth had unlawfully entered and damaged his wall. Kells produced an estate plan placing the chambers beyond her boundary. Its paper looked old, but Ruth noticed that the hives drawn upon it were modern rectangular boxes, introduced locally only after 1852. The map purported to date from 1841. Mr. Pritchard would not call it a forgery without expert testimony. He did, however, compare the cross-deed phrase with his predecessor's register and found no authorization for the alteration. He began to suspect that professional embarrassment, not caution, had kept him neutral. Ruth needed the missing papers. The cedar chest offered no secret compartment, and Hannah's slate contained breeding records rather than accounts. Yet one carved queen cage was heavier than the others. Its wooden base unscrewed to reveal a strip of silk bearing numbers and hive symbols. The sequence pointed to observation boxes, dates, and queen lines. Ruth arranged the 3 cages according to the symbols. Their perforations formed a pattern matching ventilation holes in the far wall. Pressed in the correct order, 3 hidden catches released a shallow stone panel. Behind it was not gold, but a set of copper printing plates wrapped in waxed linen, a brass seal, and Hannah's small hand press. Each plate carried mirror writing, certificates for shares in the Briarbank Bee Women's Benefit Society. The seal matched fragments on the empty wrappers. Hannah had designed a means for village women to earn shares through apiary work, receive sickness payments, and hold beneficial rights in the orchard income. But the signed certificates were still missing. One plate included a register instruction. Duplicates deposited beneath the parish poor table. Ruth remembered the parish chest fire. The documents may not have been in the chest at all. The old vestry floor had been replaced after the fire, but the poor table survived in a storeroom. Its top was a single oak slab. Underneath, protected by a screwed zinc sheet, Ruth and Mr. Pritchard found 29 parchment certificates, payment lists, and Hannah's declaration of trust. The estate was obligated to devote 1/5 of the orchard rents to the society. If no original members survived, benefits passed to their daughters, and to women maintaining approved village colonies. Elspeth Moss was the daughter of an original member. Mrs. Vale's mother appeared on the register. So did Ruth's grandmother. The final page carried Sir Matthew Alderman's signature, witnessed by 2 parish officers. A later memorandum granted the society permanent access along the disputed path and ownership of the bee chambers. Mr. Pritchard sat heavily. The estate has withheld payments for 31 years. How much? Enough to explain why Mr. Kells wants the wall. He calculated cautiously from surviving rent books. At least £600 before interest, far beyond Jonas's ready means. The legacy was valuable, but demanding it all at once could bankrupt the farms and harm tenants Hannah intended to protect. Ruth proposed an audit, transfer of specific orchard fields to the society, and staged repayment from profits. Before they could petition the court, the poor table documents disappeared from Pritchard's locked office. Suspicion fell upon Ruth. Kells told the village she had invented the trust and stolen the supposed originals after the solicitor rejected them. Constable Rusk searched Briarbank while Jonas's men began dismantling the boundary wall under authority of the disputed estate plan. Ruth stood before the hidden chamber with her injured arm bound and realized evidence alone would not save it. The certified tithe copy proved occupation, not the trust. Her handwritten slate copy proved knowledge, not ownership. The copper plates could be dismissed as abandoned tools. Then she remembered the brass seal. She had left it with Caleb Finchley, who used it to compare a mason's mark on the chamber lintel. Kells did not know it had been removed. Ruth asked Constable Rusk to let the demolition proceed only until the foundation stones were exposed. If the estate truly believed the wall theirs, it had nothing to fear from witnesses. By noon, 30 villagers had gathered. Jonas protested, but the constable insisted on order. Caleb lifted the first facing stone. Behind it lay a lead foundation box stamped repeatedly with Hannah's seal. Inside were the society rules etched upon thin copper sheets, impervious to damp, and a list of the 3 authorized document repositories: Cedar Chamber, Parish Table, and the Estate Muniment Room. The third location silenced Jonas. Kells tried to leave. Constable Rusk stopped him and found Pritchard's office key in his pocket. Under questioning, Kells claimed Jonas had ordered him to recover fraudulent papers. Jonas denied it. Their carefully maintained alliance split in public. The estate muniment room was opened that evening before the magistrate, Pritchard, and 2 tenant witnesses. A locked drawer contained Hannah's account book, 31 years of diverted payments, the altered original deed, and Daniel's notebook. Kells had hidden the stolen parchments there, expecting to destroy everything after demolition. Instead, his haste had reunited the trust's divided records. Daniel's notebook described the orchard wash, the dying bees, and Kells's threat. It did not prove murder. A physician's retained notes showed Daniel had suffered chronic heart weakness, and no honest inquiry could claim the wash killed him. But invoices proved Kells knowingly applied an arsenical mixture at excessive strength and concealed livestock deaths. The magistrates charged him with arson, theft, forgery, and malicious damage. Jonas faced civil liability for diverted funds and unlawful eviction, though no evidence showed he had ordered the fire. Ruth refused to make Daniel's death into a certainty the facts could not support. Public justice, she had learned from bees, depended upon distinguishing what one feared from what one could prove. That refusal cost her easy sympathy. A London newspaper correspondent arrived hoping to write of a murdered beekeeper and his avenging widow. When Ruth would confirm only negligence, intimidation, and documented fraud, he accused her of protecting the Alderman name. She placed Daniel's notebook before him, opened to the final complete entry, and asked him to distinguish its observations from his own invention. He left without the melodramatic story he wanted. A week later, a shorter report appeared, describing the trust and the arsenical wash accurately. Restraint had produced less sensation and more use. The preliminary hearing filled the market hall. Women named in Hannah's register sat together on 2 benches, some carrying the blue measuring cups their mothers had kept. Estate tenants stood at the rear, anxious that a judgment against Jonas would be extracted from their rents. Ruth understood their fear. Before testimony began, she asked Pritchard to file her proposed settlement so the court could see that the society sought land and accountable income rather than immediate ruin. Kells's barrister attacked the chain of custody. The slate had broken. The parchments had moved from the pour table to Pritchard's office and then to the estate drawer. Ruth had entered the hidden chamber without an estate witness. One by one, the safeguards she had built answered him. Ned described the chamber before its contents were public. Mrs. Vale produced her duplicate of Daniel's memorandum. Caleb identified the brass seal he had held before the stolen documents were found. The diocesan clerk verified the certified tithe copy. Constable Rusk testified that Kells possessed Pritchard's key. When Ruth took the stand, the barrister displayed the dead bees from Meadow End and asked whether she claimed never to have lost a colony through error. "I have lost colonies through late feeding, poor judgment, weather, and causes I could not determine," she said. The admission unsettled him. "Then your skill is not beyond question." "No skill is. That is why I kept records." She explained the difference between brood disease and acute poisoning without pretending a certainty the samples did not provide. She described how residues clustered below drainage from the wash shed, how unaffected colonies shared forage but not water, and how Kells ordered healthy boxes burned before inspection. The laboratory report supported exposure. Invoices supported quantity. Farmhands supported timing. Each fact was limited. Together they formed a pattern. Jonas testified next. He admitted seeing the altered plan but claimed Kells said it corrected an old survey error. Pritchard produced letters in which Jonas urged demolition before the December access hearing. They proved haste and self-interest, not knowledge of arson. Ruth watched anger move through the room and resisted joining it. Jonas deserved consequences proportionate to his choices. Not every crime committed near him. The most damaging witness was Kells's assistant, Thomas Bell. He had packed the vents with clay, broken the window, and carried oil to Briarbank. Kells told him the chamber housed diseased bees and forged papers that would destroy the farms. Bell believed part of it and feared dismissal. He set the western sill alight, then panicked when he learned Ruth was inside. His testimony did not excuse him. It revealed how Kells converted dependency into action while keeping his own hands clean. Bell also described Daniel's final confrontation. Daniel had found purchase orders showing that Kells received a commission from the chemical supplier. He threatened to bring the invoices to Pritchard. Kells seized Daniel's notebook, but Daniel retrieved it during the struggle. Later that day, Daniel collapsed. Bell saw no blow and no poison administered. The physician confirmed that agitation and exposure might have worsened Daniel's weak heart, but could not assign a single cause. Ruth lowered her head as the testimony ended. The truth offered no clean villain for her deepest loss. Daniel's death arose from frailty, fear, conflict, and Kells's wrongdoing without fitting the simple shape grief desired. Accepting uncertainty felt at first like losing Daniel again. Then she remembered his habit of crossing out a Hive conclusion when later evidence contradicted it. He had valued truth more than the comfort of being right. She could honor him only by doing the same. During a recess, Jonas approached beneath the gallery stairs. He looked older than at the funeral. "If you take the full arrears, Meadow End is finished," he said. "You told the court you knew nothing of the trust." "I knew there had been payments. Father called them pensions. I did not know the women owned shares. But when the records appeared, you chose the explanation that preserved your control." He had no answer. Ruth told him the society would accept land, installments, and enforceable leases if an independent audit confirmed the estate's capacity. In return, Jonas must surrender every altered document and publish a correction to the accusations against her. It was not forgiveness. It was a route by which tenants would not pay for their landlord's deception. The magistrate ordered the muniment room sealed pending civil review. For 3 days, Pritchard and 2 appointed accountants examined bundles untouched for decades. They found the trust income woven through estate accounts under vague headings: wall upkeep, orchard sundries, widow gifts. Some expenditures had genuinely maintained Briarbank before it closed. Others purchased a carriage, covered Jonas's father's gambling debt, and financed Kells's expansion of the wash shed. The accountants reconstructed totals from rent rolls, bank drafts, and Hannah's copper-backed rules. Ruth attended each session, but did not direct conclusions. When a figure favored the estate, she insisted it remain. The final sum was lower than village rumor and higher than Jonas hoped. Meanwhile, the path question threatened immediate harm. Jonas's men had left the boundary wall open during demolition. Night cold entered the bee chamber, and the old queen's cluster began consuming stores rapidly. Ruth requested temporary access to repair the breach. Jonas's barrister objected that repairs might alter evidence. Caleb proposed a reversible timber screen witnessed and sealed by both parties. The court approved it. Ruth, Ned, and Caleb worked after dark beneath constable supervision. They hung wool curtains inside, fitted the screen outside, and carried warm syrup to the colony. Ruth listened through the glass until the bee's roar settled into a lower note. Legal victory meant little if its living subject died while men argued over walls. The episode influenced the court more than rhetoric. The society's claim was not a scheme to extract forgotten money. Its members were already preserving the property, knowledge, and pollinating stock the trust described. On the final morning, daughters and granddaughters of 12 original members proved their identities through baptismal registers and marriage entries. Others could not. Hannah's rules anticipated that records might fail. Any woman who completed 2 seasons of approved apiary work could earn a new share. The trust was hereditary enough to preserve obligations, but open enough to remain a working institution rather than a closed family prize. Ruth herself qualified twice, through her grandmother and through 11 years of beekeeping. She declined the chairmanship until members could vote after hearing the rules. At the first meeting, held beneath the temporary roof, 19 women marked paper ballots. Ruth received 14 votes, Mrs. Vale 4, and Elspeth 1. Elspeth protested that she had not stood. Mrs. Vale said that was why someone voted for her. Their laughter was the first unguarded sound the honey house had heard since the fire. The court confirmed the society's ownership of Briarbank, its chambers, the path, and 4 productive orchard fields in settlement of much of the debt. Jonas retained Meadow End under strict accounts and lost control of the trust rents. He was ordered to return Ruth's marriage property and pay compensation for the fire. Kells received a prison sentence after his assistant testified in exchange for leniency. The judgment was read without the dramatic applause imagined by the newspaper man. Tenant farmers calculated what the transfer meant for their leases. Women traced their mothers' names in the copied register. Bell's wife wept quietly, knowing his lesser sentence still meant months without wages. Ruth felt relief, but no triumph large enough to erase the funeral road or the flames above Briarbank. Outside the hall, Pritchard handed her the farmhouse inventory she had requested on the day of Daniel's burial. It listed her press, copper pans, 12 hive boxes built with her marriage money, and the silver value of household linen. Jonas's claim that all had vanished into debt was false. The court's order allowed her to reclaim the objects or their assessed worth. She chose the press, the boxes, and the linen. She left the polished dining chairs at Meadow End in exchange for seasoned boards and 2 barrels of apples for the society. The decision puzzled Pritchard until she explained that furniture consumed space, while tools and food created income. At Meadow End, Ruth entered the honey room for the first time since her eviction. Dust covered the press. Daniel's chalk calculations remained on one wall, ending midway through a column. Jonas waited by the door but did not cross the threshold. Ruth packed the small implements herself. Beneath the rendering table she found her mother's black notebooks, which Jonas had said were lost. Whether he had hidden them or merely failed to search, she did not ask. She opened the final volume and saw Daniel's handwriting beside her mother's. Ruth hears a colony before the rest of us see it. The praise broke something she had held rigid through the hearings. She sat upon an overturned box and wept, not because the court had restored property, but because 2 people who had known her skill were gone, while she had spent months defending its existence to strangers. Mrs. Vale, who had come with the wagon, waited without speaking. When Ruth could stand, they loaded the notebooks last, wrapped in dry linen. Jonas offered to carry the press. Ruth allowed it. Restitution needed physical weight. The wagon passed along the once disputed path before half the village. No one cheered. Ned walked beside the wheels counting every item against the inventory, and Caleb held the gate wide. At Briarbank, society members placed the press beneath the repaired roof and arranged the notebooks in the driest cabinet. The return was plain, witnessed, and entered into accounts. That made it stronger than ceremony. Spring did not transform Briarbank overnight. The honey house roof took 3 months and £46 to rebuild. Ruth spent another 12 on sound hive timber and 6 on drainage. Society members contributed labor or small weekly sums, while the transferred orchards provided rent. Ruth bred queens from Hannah's surviving line, crossing carefully with healthy local stocks, rather than claiming an ancient strain could solve every disease. By the second summer, colony losses had fallen by half. The society paid its first sickness allowance to a washerwoman with an injured hand. It trained 6 girls in hive inspection, record-keeping, and wax preparation. Farmers paid modest pollination fees, and pale Briarbank wax became valued by a nearby bookbinder and chapel candlemaker. Ned attended lessons in the restored bottling room and became Ruth's first salaried assistant. Mrs. Vale chaired the benefit committee. Elspeth received the payments denied her mother, but insisted that part be used for a village dispensary fund. Jonas came once, without his polished funeral voice. He returned Daniel's beekeeping coat and admitted he had known Kells altered the boundary plan, though not that he burned the house. Ruth accepted the coat, not the excuse. Reconciliation, she told him, required truthful accounts and restitution over time. He began making both, watched by trustees who no longer depended upon his goodwill. The settlement was a judgment, not a harvest. On the morning after it was signed, Ruth returned to Briarbank and found rain passing through 3 places in the temporary roof. 7 colonies required feeding. The transferred pear fields had been pruned harshly under Kells and would yield little for a season. Hannah's copper plates had survived, but the wintering chamber's lower air channel had cracked during demolition. Ruth placed every expected shilling into a budget. The society could borrow against future orchard rents, yet debt had already been used too often to make women obedient. She proposed that they repair only the bottling room, eastern roof slope, and drainage before spring. The rest would wait. Some members wanted a grand building worthy of their victory. Elspeth supported Ruth. "A dry corner paid for is finer than a ballroom owed for," she said. Caleb Finchley tested the chamber arch by tapping each brick with a small hammer. 2 sections had settled where roots entered the foundation. He estimated £30 for full reconstruction, more than the society possessed. Ruth asked whether the bees required full reconstruction. Caleb considered the airflow, then designed 2 timber braces and a removable lime-plastered panel costing £3 12 shillings. It was inelegant but safe. He showed Ned how to mix lime slowly so it would not crack from heat. The boy absorbed every instruction until numbers entered the conversation. He could judge an angle by eye, but confused pounds with shillings. Ruth began evening lessons using hive accounts. If 8 candles sold for 10 pence and wax cost 3 pence, he calculated the remainder in chalk. Mrs. Vale joined, admitting she had always trusted shopkeepers to total her purchases. Soon 5 women attended, bringing babies, mending, and questions about rent notices. Briarbank's first school was born without a declaration. Jonas's first repayment fell due in February. He sent half the amount and a letter blaming poor cider prices. The trustees could have returned to court. Instead, Ruth and Pritchard inspected his books. Meadow End had indeed suffered, partly because Kells had concealed orchard expenses and partly because Jonas had drawn money for household luxuries while wages remained unpaid. "You cannot audit how a man feeds his family," Jonas snapped. "The trust is not paying for imported wine," Ruth replied. She reduced the immediate installment in exchange for 2 healthy cows, seasoned roof timber, and written tenant leases preventing retaliatory eviction. Jonas agreed because refusal would expose him again before the magistrates. The arrangement benefited Briarbank without stripping Meadow End of planting money. Justice required pressure, but Ruth would not reproduce the recklessness used against her. March brought the first queen-rearing challenge. Hannah's dark colony had survived, Yet its queen was old and laid in an uneven pattern. Ruth selected larvae no more than a day old and transferred them with a quill tip into wax cups. Of 12, only 4 were accepted. One chilled when a sudden wind entered the chamber. Another emerged with a damaged leg. Ruth destroyed neither record nor failure. She wrote the conditions beside each result. Samuel Pike suggested presenting only the successful queens when visitors came from the County Agricultural Society. "Gentlemen prefer confidence," he said. "Then they may learn to prefer evidence." The visitors arrived expecting quaint village hives managed by grateful widows. Ruth showed them the ventilation channels, survival tables, and comparisons between sprayed and unsprayed orchards. A gray-bearded lecturer challenged her claim that the blue-green residue contributed to the deaths. Ruth agreed that correlation alone was insufficient. She produced sealed samples, weather records, and control comb from the chalk down. Her restraint impressed him more than certainty would have. He offered to have the samples examined at the county laboratory. The report, returned 6 weeks later, identified copper salts and arsenic in proportions dangerous to insects. It could not determine who applied them, but invoices and witness statements had already established that question. More importantly, the findings persuaded neighboring farmers to abandon Kells's cheap wash. Briarbank published a one-page notice describing safer timing and dilution, printed from Hannah's restored hand press. Ruth placed Hannah's name above her own. Not everyone welcomed the society. The innkeeper complained that women gathered at Briarbank were neglecting households. An anonymous petition claimed the benefit fund encouraged widows to defy lawful male guardians. 2 orchard owners withdrew their hives rather than let Ruth inspect spray records. The setbacks wounded because victory had made her expect reason to travel faster. Elspeth reminded her that Hannah's work had been erased precisely because it threatened ordinary arrangements, not because it lacked merit. Ruth kept the door open to skeptics but changed no rule for them. Owners who wanted society queens had to disclose treatments and allow inspection. Public benefit could not rest upon hidden risks. In May, the pear blossom opened across the transferred fields. Ruth had feared rain, but 3 clear mornings brought a steady hum from tree to tree. Ned counted worker visits on marked branches while girls from the evening lessons timed intervals with a borrowed watch. The exercise produced imperfect figures and immense concentration. When petals fell, tiny fruit remained on nearly twice as many spurs as the previous year. Income followed slowly. Pollination fees came first, then wax. Ruth revived Hannah's method of filtering pale wax through warmed charcoal and fine linen. The process produced clean sheets suitable for delicate work. A bookbinder in Lewis ordered 10 pounds for conservation of old bindings. A chapel requested candles that burned without guttering. The orders justified wages for 3 women during summer. Ruth insisted the society distinguish wages from benefits. Work earned payment at stated rates. Sickness and widow allowances arose from shared entitlement, not gratitude. Each Saturday, accounts were read aloud before 2 witnesses. Members who could not read learned to recognize their names and amounts. The ceremony was plain, sometimes tedious, and more protective than any speech. The honey crop disappointed. Colonies spent much of their strength rebuilding after winter, and one promising hive swarmed beyond recovery. Ruth stood beneath the empty branch holding a useless skep, while frustration rose hot behind her eyes. Daniel had always climbed for swarms, moving with a confidence she lacked. For an hour, she blamed herself for missing the queen cells. Then Ned brought the register. The warning signs had been recorded, but Ruth had postponed dividing the hive because she was preparing for the agricultural visitors. Competence had not failed. Attention had been divided. She altered the work rota so no public demonstration could supersede daily inspections. That admission mattered to Ned. He had broken a glass observation pane the week before and hidden the crack behind a cloth. Now he confessed. Ruth required him to help pay for the replacement from 2 weeks' wages, but did not dismiss him. Concealment, not error, was the danger they could not afford. By midsummer, the chamber held 8 observation colonies. Visitors watched queens lay, Workers exchange food, and wax scales appear beneath abdomens. Ruth never called the bees obedient. A colony survived by distributed labor, changing roles and information carried through movement and scent. The analogy to the society was obvious enough that she did not state it. Elspeth weakened during July. Years of laundry work had stiffened her hands and damaged her lungs. The society paid for broth, coal, and visits from the district nurse. When Elspeth protested that she had contributed little, Mrs. Vale read aloud the rule bearing her mother's share. The payment was not charity. It was a debt delayed across a generation. Ruth sat with Elspeth one warm evening and brought the blue bee cup back from the restored display. Elspeth asked whether children had learned Hannah's story. "They complain because I make them copy her dates accurately." "Then she is safe." Elspeth died the following morning. At her funeral, the society's women carried small rosemary branches rather than expensive flowers. Ruth placed the blue cup in the cabinet beside Hannah's veil, labeled with both women's names. Historical recovery could not return stolen years, but it could prevent a second disappearance. Late summer exposed a flaw in the transferred land settlement. One orchard stream crossed a corner still owned by Jonas. During drought, he diverted water toward Meadow End's cattle troughs, leaving Briarbank's young trees dry. He claimed an ancient right. Ruth could have answered with another public accusation. Instead, she surveyed the channel with Caleb and found that both properties depended upon a broken sluice, once designed to divide flow. The repair cost £5 and required access from each side. Jonas resisted until his own lower meadow began to flood after a sudden shower. They met at the sluice with tools, spoke only of levels and boards, and restored the division according to the oldest marks. The work did not forgive him. It established a practical peace, enforced by a structure neither could manipulate unseen. Daniel's coat remained hanging in Ruth's room for months. It smelled of smoke after the fire, and retained a dark stain near one pocket. She could not wear it, and disliked seeing it unused. In October, she cut the sound cloth into protective pads for carrying observation frames. The first incision felt like damage. The finished pieces saved bees from cold drafts. Memory, she understood, did not reside in keeping an object unchanged. Mr. Pritchard completed the audit before Christmas. Diversions exceeded the first estimate by £83, but old accounts also showed legitimate repairs the estate had paid on Briarbank's behalf. Ruth included those credits. Pritchard remarked that few claimants would reduce a judgment voluntarily. "If our accounts are justice only when they favor us, Kells has taught us nothing." The final agreement placed the bee wall and access path in the society's name permanently. No individual, including Ruth, could sell them. If the society dissolved, the property would pass to the parish for agricultural education and relief of working women. Hannah's intention no longer depended upon one locked chest or one courageous heir. Winter returned with sleet against the new slates. This time the hidden chamber remained dry. Ruth compared the colonies inside with those in ordinary outdoor boxes. The chamber bees consumed less food, but 2 colonies suffered damp until Ned adjusted the upper shutters. Hannah's design was excellent, not infallible. They improved it with removable trays and recorded the change beside the original plan, rather than pretending preservation meant refusing adaptation. On Christmas Eve, the society distributed allowances to 9 households. Each envelope bore Hannah's divided crown seal impressed in plain wax. Children filled the bottling room for spiced buns. The innkeeper came reluctantly because his sister qualified for a payment. He did not apologize for the petition, but he purchased 2 candles and stayed through the reading of accounts. Ruth counted that as movement, not conversion. The following February, a girl named Alice Crowther arrived before dawn carrying a dying colony. Her father had ordered it burned, but she had noticed the brood smelled normal. Ruth found starvation, not disease. They warmed the box gradually, fed the cluster, and saved the queen. Alice became the 7th student and the first from a family that had openly opposed Briarbank. Ruth asked why she had risked punishment. "Because you wrote on the notice that different deaths leave different signs." There it was. Not loyalty to Ruth, nor fascination with the hidden chamber, but a transferable way of seeing. The legacy had begun to live beyond its discoverer. At the second spring bloom, orchards across the valley showed fewer empty branches. Farmers who once burned whole apiaries now isolated suspect frames and sought inspection. The county society purchased copies of Briarbank's wintering plans. Payment went partly to repairs, partly to the benefit fund, and partly to Hannah's credited heirs according to the trust. Ruth moved from the patched bottling room into 2 modest chambers built above the honey house. She chose a window facing east. From there she could see both Briarbank and the distant roof of Meadow End. The view no longer felt like exile. It showed the scale of a landscape whose parts harmed or sustained one another, regardless of deeds. On the anniversary of Daniel's funeral, Ruth carried the surviving queen cage to the eastern wall. The repaired copper vents shone softly between old bricks. Bees crossed above her in purposeful lines, some toward Meadow End, others toward cottage gardens newly planted with borage and thyme. No wall could compel them to honor a boundary drawn by greed. Ruth placed Daniel's penciled question beside Hannah's records in a glass-fronted cabinet. She had found why the old bees flew east: warmth, memory, and a landscape designed to sustain them. Yet the more important answer lived outside the cabinet, in wages paid, orchards flowering, and women whose work now bore their own names. At dusk, the hidden wintering chamber began its deep, even hum. Once, Ruth had heard that sound as proof that someone had concealed a legacy from her. Now it filled the restored honey house like the pulse of a home, neither inherited by mercy nor rescued by fortune, but rebuilt through patient hands and made large enough to shelter others.